By the time the first few episodes of PV Series 1 were released, I was already working on a second series. In fact, if I remember correctly, I already had the entire series filmed and the first 2 to 3 episodes edited for Series 2 by the time episode 6 of Series 1 came out. This is the season where a lot of my ideas for PV really started to come to life, and it barely remains to this day my favourite series of Prehistoric Valley. It was also the start of several major upgrades in quality. From this point onwards, I barely made any sound effects with my mouth, and I turned the raw camera audio way down. Every episode in this series was completely edited in LumaFusion, and most major characters had their own theme tune. I even have a list of them, which I will show here. This season also features, in my opinion, much better use of stock footage, something that is immediately evident from the opening of the first episode. Speaking of the first episode, let's just quickly recap what happens. We return to my personal favourite location, the Forgotten Forest, to find that not much has changed. Gigabyte is still top dog, Frost still slinks around under him, though I deliberately gloss over the fact that Serration is currently absent. I'm kind of surprised no one noticed that. We also see the arrival of the Triceratops herd. They don't do much yet, but will be very important later on. We then move to the eastern prairies, where we get to see not Hatchet, because after his somewhat lackluster story in Series 1, I wasn't really expecting him to be a popular character. I also didn't really have many ideas for him, of things to do aside from getting a new mate, Machete, but I did have some interesting ideas for a different character, Rossa. The idea behind Rossa's character was to show both sides of the effect caused by the rift reopening, while the Triceratops herd show the dangers caused by invasive species to others. Rossa shows the story from the perspective of a new arrival in PV. We see her fend off the ceratosaurs, and that's the episode. On to episode 2. Episode 2 starts with a proper introduction to the trike herd. We meet Terence and immediately see how dominant they are despite being herbivores when they push a Pachycephalosaurus out of her grazing position, and we begin to get an idea of what life is like in the herd. There is also a little secret to reveal here. There was originally going to be a shot where the camera follows Gigabyte as he walks around the herd, but I double-tapped record without realising, so I ended up taking a snapshot of the 1-second video and using it as a teaser in a community post. We then move to the Eastern Plains, where we see Rossa and get to our first big secret this episode. The shot where Rossa finds the fence wasn't part of the original script. I was originally going to try to keep the backgrounds as wild looking as possible, but while I was out filming, I had the idea of including a fence as a reminder that the valley was once a lab. There was also originally meant to be a short scene where Rossa walks past a herd of stegs, but doesn't attack. I can't remember why this was scrapped or when. Regardless, we get one of 2 appearances of Hatchet and Machete this season, and we get to see the reason why Atlas was name-dropped at the end of Series 1. I was already planning for him to meet Rossa, who was originally going to be played by the PNSO Mapu, but it was out of stock on everything dinosaur. We then get to see the start of possibly one of my favourite arcs from Series 2, Kai being beached. This allowed me to reuse some of my old ideas about him potentially dying at the end of Series 1. It also gave me the chance to make him a bit more likeable than in Series 1, where all he really did was kill things, and to generally make him more of a character than a plot device. It also kind of ties into the theme of Series 2, where ecosystems are turned upside down during the series. back in the Forgotten Forest, we get to see more of the trike herd, and we meet one of my personal favourite characters from a writing perspective, Thorn. The idea of a herbivorous antagonist came from the general lack of such characters in DinoTube, as well as the fact that herbivorous animals can often cause just as many problems in foreign habitats as predators. Feral goats on the Galapagos Islands cause problems for the native tortoises, competing for food and destroying their shade. Box moth caterpillars devastated the bushes in my garden until we found a solution. Given that the lifestyle of the trikes in PV is very combat oriented, one of them seemed like the perfect choice for a storytelling perspective. Speaking of which, here we get to probably one of the single biggest moments of Prehistoric Valley. The moment where, in my opinion, the old generation of PV ends, when Gigabyte gets stabbed through the chest by Thorn. While some may argue that his actual death scene has more impact, this is where the injury that killed him was dealt. Curiously enough, my mum, who had no idea which scene was being filmed, happened to take out her phone and grab a picture of me filming it. This one. She had no clue just how important this scene would be. I debated long and hard about killing off Gigabyte. He was and still is one of my favourite Series 1 characters, but if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't have been able to give Serration the spotlight she deserved, and Thorn probably wouldn't have seemed nearly as intimidating of an antagonist. With that, on to episode 3. The first obvious thing to talk about with episode 3 is that it's the only one in the entirety of PV to have a great big viewer discretion warning at the start. This wasn't originally part of the plan, but a family member, who I will leave unnamed, seemed to think it was necessary. I guess my strawberry jam gore was too good. In all seriousness though, this is, in my opinion, one of the darkest episodes of PV. We start the episode off with Kai being eaten alive by a baryonyx before he is saved by the timely arrival of the sauropod herd. We get some info about how the rift reopening has affected the ecosystem of PV, and we finally get to see Diane, though she won't get a name until episode 5. Moving to the Eastern Plains, we get to hear something interesting, Atlas's theme song. Yes, he does have one, but since almost every other time after the introduction of theme songs we see him in the presence of Rosa or Mango, we don't get to hear it often. To be honest, I don't really like it that much. It's good, I just don't think it entirely fits him. We then cut back to the lake where we get to see Diane in action. Nothing much more to say here. Then we move to the forest where we get to see Frost in action, which I'm glad of, because usually when we see him, he's overshadowed by another character. Then we get to the big one, Gigabyte's actual death scene. I'm not particularly happy with the coughing noises in this one, they sound a bit too human, but the cinematic boom when we cut to the title screen I did like. Moving on to episode 4, we start with a quick confirmation that Gigabyte is actually dead and isn't going to come back next episode like this is DI Season 1. We then move to the Triceratops herd, where Thorn overthrows Terrence, which is where we get to our first secret. This scene was actually reshot at one point because I didn't like the way Terrence flipped through the air when Thorn beats him. I thought it looked a bit unnatural for such a heavy animal to do that. However, at some point before editing, I accidentally deleted the second version of that scene, so I had to resort to the original. We then see Atlas and Rossa fight off a Giga that invades their territory. By the way, this Giganotosaurus actually does have a name, though at the time of Series 2's production it was just meant to be a generic Giga. I won't spoil any more, but she's quite an important character for Series 4. Regardless, the obvious purpose of this scene is to give Atlas and Rossa something to bond over, a common enemy for them to fight. We then get to the highlight of the episode, in my opinion, the end to Kai's arc this season. I remember during the premiere for this episode, I was asked how I did the rain. Long story short, I just cheated and used a hosepipe. This was a somewhat difficult operation, as it required me to puppet the figures as well as operate the camera and shield the camera, all while my mum drenched us with the hosepipe. You may notice in the episode that the rain stops shortly after Kai is freed. This is because my coat was already soaked and I couldn't bother getting any wetter than I already was. Regardless, Kai beats Diane and the episode ends, setting up the start of episode 5, but that I'm going to save for part 4.